Welcome to this episode of Exploring the Humanities, Voices from the Hong Kong Polytechnic University. Our podcasts allow us to showcase the exciting and innovative work being done by our colleagues in the humanities, intersecting with fields as varied as aviation, mental and physical health, virtual reality, design, neuroscience. I am Reña Lopez from the Faculty of Humanities. With us today we have Professor Matthew Sommer, Bowman Family Professor of History from the Department of History, Stanford University. We are very, very lucky to have him here today to talk about a topic very close to us, which is Imperial China.
Well, thank you, Professor Lopez, for your warm welcome. It's an honor to be here and flattering that people are interested in my work.
Your work centers around society in the late Ming, early Qing dynasties, specifically on the 17th to 19th centuries. Tell us a little bit more about that.
I am a social and legal historian of the Qing dynasty, the last dynasty in China from 1644 to 1912. And I use legal cases from the archives as the main source for all of my research. And so as a social and legal historian using legal cases, my main interests are gender, sexuality, and family. And I'm especially interested in the lives of ordinary people in China, influenced by the classic social histories of England and France that influenced me as a graduate student.
Specifically, you cover topics such as abortion and transgender issues, autopsies. What is the common thread running through all of this work?
Since the vast majority of people in China in the Qing dynasty were illiterate, the evidence in the legal cases, their testimony, their confessions, this is really the closest we can get, I think, to their own experiences, given the sources that survive. So I guess the common thread is that I use legal cases from the archives, original legal cases from the archives in China, to look at a range of issues related to legal and social history, especially sexuality, gender, and family. Everything that I've done falls within that broad umbrella.
So tell us, how did you get into that legal aspect of things, especially in Imperial China?
I did my PhD at UCLA, and my advisor and mentor there was Philip Huang Zongzhi in Chinese. And he had started working on Qing legal history, and he was somebody who pioneered the use of these huge archives of legal cases that exist in China. Very few people had looked at them before. This was back in the late 1980s. I started my PhD in 1989 in the fall. And in that year, among other things, Professor Wang had a research seminar in which he showed us examples of various kinds of original primary sources that he thought offered big opportunities that were either ignored or underexplored. And so one of the things he showed us some examples of Qing dynasty legal cases, a couple examples from the county courts, which was the lowest court, and a couple examples from the central courts, death penalty cases reported up from the provinces to the center for approval. I was absolutely captivated by these. I think that the historian's first task is to tell a story, and often a very colorful story. And this is why legal cases make such good novels, such good movies. I was absolutely captivated by not just the interesting and dramatic stories, but also the fact that so many of them featured gender relations and sexual relations among very ordinary people, ordinary peasants, but also marginalized people, beggars, sailors, soldiers, hired laborers. As people may know, in Qing dynasty China, there was a very skewed sex ratio, a sex ratio imbalance. There were far more men than women. That was especially extreme among the poor. There were many all-male communities, or many, in villages, you might have a surplus of 25 or 30% of the men who would never marry. I became interested in how ordinary people lived under these circumstances in China. And the legal cases gave all sorts of interesting examples of sexual relationships, marital relationships, and so on that were not orthodox. Basically, the more I read, the more fascinated I became. I also realized that past scholarship about gender, sexuality, and family, to the extent we had any, there wasn't very much. It all focused on the elite. And it generally focused on writings produced by the elite about themselves. What little they said about ordinary people tended to be very stereotyped and prejudiced. it seemed to me that not only was this material very interesting in itself, but also it offered an opportunity to tell a new story about what life was like for most people in China. So that's really how it began. And then, one thing led to another. Here I am, many years later.
Tell us a little bit more about the legal system at the time so that we understand how come all of those cases were actually documented.
Sure. The Qing Empire was a pluralistic empire that included many different regions and peoples. I focus on the Chinese, China proper, the 18 traditional provinces of China proper that belonged to the former Ming that were conquered by the Qing. And the Qing basically continued the former Ming system for administering China. So it was divided into basically 18 provinces, subdivided into about 175 prefectures, which were in turn subdivided into about 1,500 counties or districts. This was a very centralized system in many respects. The court of first instance, the lowest court, was on the county level. There was a magistrate there in charge of the county. He was in charge of tax collecting, law and order, solving murder cases, suppressing rebellion, and so on. If there was a crime or some other lawsuit, it would be reported to the county court. And then the way it was supposed to work with crime, violent acts especially, depending on how serious the act was, it was supposed to be sentenced according to the Qing Code, Da Qing Liu Li. And then depending on the severity of the penalty, it had to be reviewed at a certain level of the hierarchy. If it was just a simple beating, then the county magistrate could do that on his own authority. If it was a death penalty case, like a homicide or a rape or something political, that had to go all the way to Beijing, because in theory, only the emperor could take life. He was the giver and taker of life through his amnesties and famine relief on the one hand, and then through a monopoly over the taking of life on the other, one of his godlike attributes. And so in Beijing, we have an archive of something like 1 million of these death penalty reports from all over China proper, most from the 18th and 19th centuries. So that's a huge ocean of material. People have barely scratched the surface. There are also some in Taiwan. So there was the county court at the bottom, and then there was the central court system at the top. And depending on the nature of the case, it might or might not be reported up the chain of command. So people who do Qing legal history like me, we tend to rely on these two kinds of archives. We don't really have any archives from the middle, unfortunately, but there are a couple quite rich ones from the county level. The most important are in Sichuan. It's unfortunate so little seems to survive, but there are a couple that are very rich. And those are county archives. So there you see all sorts of things. You see major crime, but also all sorts of mundane, petty disputes, lawsuits, fighting over a cow, marital problems. In the Beijing archive, what you see is the worst violent crimes. The majority are homicide of different kinds. But you also see rape, banditry, some, very few, but some cases of heterodoxy, political things. So the cases I talk about related to transgender, the crime being a male masqueraded in female attire, those were considered related to heterodoxy. So they were death penalty cases. They were reported all the way to the top. So these are the kinds of materials that exist, and they reflect the sort of centralized nature of the system. Your
latest book is The Fox Spirit, The Stone Maiden, and Other Transgender Histories from the Late Imperial China. What is the definition of transgender?
I think we have to begin by drawing a distinction between transgender identity, as we know it today, and on the one hand, and how historians think about transgender in the past. A core value of transgender politics identity today is self-determination. In other words, it's not up to some doctor or your parents or the government to tell you what your gender is. Rather, your gender is a matter of self-determination based on your own subjective understanding of who you are. And from that standpoint, the body is not destiny. So your anatomy or your genes, those are not determinative. Rather, it is your subjective understanding of yourself, your identity, which defines your gender, as opposed to biological sex. There is debate about where to draw the line, but that's the rough and ready distinction that we make. But if you think about it, as an historian, if I want to talk about people in the 18th century in China, and I take seriously the value of self-determination, who am I to put labels on people who cannot speak for themselves? And so we have to be very cautious. But the other thing is that people who transgendered, in other words, who moved away from the gender assigned at birth, they have existed, it seems, in all times and places. So this is a topic that is very interesting and worthwhile to study as a historian. At the same time, the kind of vocabulary we use now, the kind of identity concepts we use now, these are new. For example, the term transgender as a kind of identity category or umbrella category, this really didn't become widespread until the 1990s in the United States. And my sense is that it really began in the United States and now is spread elsewhere as well, Western Europe probably as well. But, the 1990s, I'm old enough to feel like that was just yesterday, right? And so we have to be very careful about anachronism. In other words, when we study, for example, 18th century China, I have to be very careful not to assume what is familiar today in terms of categories and vocabulary and project it onto the people in the past places. We look at practices, what people do and how they talk about what they do. And this is inspired most importantly by the work of Susan Stryker, who is a very important pioneering transgender activist and historian. She has this great work, Transgender History, which is a history of this movement in the modern United States. Everyone interested in the topic should read that. And she defines transgender as practice, and to paraphrase what she says, transgender people are those who move away from the gender assigned at birth across a socially imposed boundary towards some other destination. And I find this very useful, and this is basically what historians are now using to think about this, because by looking at practice and not assuming motivation, not assuming a given identity, her definition allows us to think about different times and places and to compare them, to notice what's different about them, what's similar about them. And in a sense, we can get past the roadblock of trying to guess whether, if they were alive today, they would identify as transgender. So, for example, there were people who cross-dressed in the past. We don't know if they would identify if they were transgender today. We just don't know. I mean, there are people today who cross-dress who don't identify as transgender.
In the book, you do give a number of examples of different individuals, for some of whom it seemed to have been a choice to do this change of gender, but for others it seemed to have been imposed.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit more about those examples.
So I have a number of fascinating cases, and not very many, I should say, of this was the crime, according to the state, the crime of, quote, 男扮女装, a man masquerading in women's attire, quote unquote. And that was a crime prosecuted under the laws against heterodoxy. I can get into that in a minute if you want. But those cases involved individuals who had what was judged to be normal male anatomy, but who were living as women. They were wearing women's clothing, they had their hair done up in the way a woman would. In the Qing dynasty, men had to shave the front of the head, grow out the back hair into a long single braid, and failure to do this for men was punished by death. Right? It was a sign of loyalty to the Manchu Qing dynasty. So these are individuals who had done this. They had pierced their ears. Some of them had bound their feet loosely, and they were living as women, and they were playing women's roles, occupation otherwise traditionally thought of as women's roles. Those individuals, I hesitate to use the word choice, although I do in the book. These are people who chose to transgender, if you will, in the sense that at some point they made a decision to do this. Nobody forced them to do it, right? Now, but I would put quotation marks around the word choice, because I think that most transgender people would probably say they didn't choose to be transgender any more than I choose to be cisgender. It's just the way I am, right? So I mean this in the specific sense that these are individuals who at some point made a decision to start presenting as a woman, to live as a woman at great risk themselves. So there, you have those cases. But I also, because of Susan Stryker's definition based on practice, based on moving away from the gender assigned at birth, to me, it's interesting to use this to think about a range of other kinds of people who in the past have not usually been thought of as transgender. So here I include, for example, the male clergy and the female clergy among the Taoists and the Buddhists. If we look, for example, at Buddhist clergy, they would shave their heads, they would wear a gender-neutral robe, they would move away from their family. So the term in Chinese is 出家, to move away or out of the family, into a monastic community. of ritual kin. They would change their names, the Buddhists would take the surname Shi from Shakyamuni, Shi Jiamuni. So they all had that. And then they would take a given name, which was usually 2 characters from a sutra. These would be assigned by a mentor or a master, a teacher. And they would join this ritual lineage of clerical kin. And they would forswear sex, they would forswear procreation, they would forswear marriage and having families. What replaced the family, what replaced the lineage was the ritual community. And so, I mean, they did not identify as the opposite sex, but they certainly did not identify with normative gender roles, which were based on family roles organized around marriage and procreation, right? Because they had forsworn all of that. So from that standpoint, leaving the family, 出家, meant leaving behind normative gender roles. And while that has not usually been thought of as transgender, quote unquote, it's very interesting for me to think about that in relationship to other kinds of practices, transing practices that we can find in Qing society. So if we look at the figure of the male masquerading in female attire, quote unquote, that was criminalized, the assumption was that that person was a sex predator who was aimed at insinuating himself into female company in order to seduce or rape chaste wives and daughters of good families. This is similar to the current paranoid fantasy about trans women as well, right? That somehow they're trying to sneak into women's space. In other words, they're fake women, right? That's the paranoid fantasy. But there was a parallel stereotype of clergy as the same thing. So these male monks, they may claim to have abstained, to have forsworn sex and all, meat and wine and all these things they're not supposed to have. But we know what they really want to do. What they really want to do is get people to lower their guard so they can sort of get in there and again, rape or seduce women and so there are all sorts of versions of this in fiction and folklore and so on like that. And so what's interesting to me is that the stereotype of the clergy as sexual predators is basically the same stereotype as that of the female-presenting man, right, which is the stereotype. And then they're 2 sides of the same coin. So to me, once I make the move of thinking about the clergy and leaving the family as a transgender maneuver, it sort of illuminates these connections with other things that I would not have noticed otherwise. So for me, that's very interesting. I also talk about eunuchs. Also, when a boy was sold usually by his parents to the eunuch establishment, was castrated and then enslaved into the imperial service, that was also called leaving the family, 出家, the same term they used for clergy. And they also obviously they had to forswear sex, at least conventional sex, but they also had to forswear marriage, adoption, having families, and so on. And there were similar fantasies about eunuchs. So there was a paranoid fantasy that an intact male would somehow pretend to be a eunuch, disguise as a eunuch, get into the palace, and then rape or seduce the emperor's women, right? There were also these notions that eunuchs could use black magic to restore their genitals in order to do the same thing. So you have this sort of body of paranoid fantasies around sexual predation in which the surface presentation is a disguise to enable this nefarious predator to somehow get into space where he's not supposed to be. So in a sense, that stereotype of the predator kind of unites these various scenarios, if that makes sense.
It makes sense. And what's also interesting is that this is quite popular in the literature, isn't it?
It is indeed, yes.
Why do you think that is?
I try to use fiction in the book to eliminate this. Most people in China were illiterate, as I said before. But you have these genres of fiction, popular fiction, written in more or less in a kind of vernacular language. These were written by literate men who are, mostly members of the elite and basically for an elite male audience. And what's interesting is that these people, these men, both the readers and the writers, they had the same Confucian education as the officials did. So they were all, in a sense, broadly speaking, part of the same Confucian worldview. And yet if you look at this fiction, all these wild stories of ghosts and fox spirits and sex predators and so on, you get a sense of how people thought about this outside of the law, outside of the Orthodox context. And I think that in a sense that fiction, those stereotypes, they give voice to wider perceptions.
One of the case stories that you mentioned of this man who masqueraded as a woman for almost most of his life until they were 60 and they were found out.
This is the midwife.
The midwife. Tell us a little bit more about that story.
I would refrain from judging whether this was a masquerade. It was judged to be a masquerade. I think this is just how this person wanted to live their life. But who am I to say? One of the challenges is we can only see these stories through the legal cases. And those are heavily biased by the people who produced them, who were these judges, right? Who, because the stereotype of the sexual predator was so strong, when they encountered someone like this, they assumed they already knew what was going on. Oh, and this is obviously a sex predator. And so what they tended to do was torture people into producing a confession that would satisfy their preconception. So in the case you mentioned of this midwife, the governor who reports the case to the emperor, he says, we know without even asking this person what they were up to. They must have raped and seduced lots and lots of women, right? Well, from the evidence of the case itself, there's no evidence this person ever had sex with anybody, quite frankly. And yet the governor or the magistrate, they already know, right? But in that case, so this is a person who had what the midwife later said was normal male anatomy, who had been assigned male at birth, as we say now, who at some point in their 20s started to live as a woman. And they moved away from their home community for anonymity. And this is something that transgender people do sometimes today as well, to get a completely fresh start in a new persona. And so this person moved away from home and then showed up in a rural community, dressed as a woman with women's hairstyle, bound feet, earrings and so on, and said that I am a widow and my evil in-laws were trying to force me to remarry to another man, but I am a chaste Confucian widow. I was loyal to my dead husband, so of course I would never remarry. So I had to run away in order to escape this fate. And so I ran away first to a Buddhist nunnery. I shaved my head and became a nun. But then I decided I wanted to return to lay life so that I could adopt a son to carry on my dead husband's line. This is the most loyal and chaste thing a wife could do, a widow could do. And so they had grown out their hair. Now, bear in mind, if this person had their hair tonsured the way a man should, the front is all shaved and the back is left long. So how do you switch hairstyles from that to a woman's hairstyle? So what this person had done is shave the whole head. And as a nun, you can do that. And then had grown out their hair at uniform length and done it the way a woman would. So it's kind of an interesting backstory. So this person shows up in this community, living as a woman, and says, I'm a midwife. And they, long story short, they end up living in this community, practicing as a midwife, apparently very successfully because they managed to earn money, and they use that money to buy land, and they're sort of living off the rent. By communist standards in the 20th century, they would have been a rich peasant, at least, if not a small landlord. And then they start to assemble a kind of family of what you might call chosen kin. So they adopt a son, supposedly to carry on the dead husband's family line, then find a wife for this son. And then for some reason, it's not clear, they adopt a son for the son, so a grandson. So you have a whole sort of lineage established through adoption and marriage. And then also, apparently this person was very popular in the community. They had 3 ganyuar. This is a kind of adoption. These were young women who had been sort of like goddaughters. And this ganchin kind of adoption is something that was done between people of different generations who have a very, very close quasi-kinship relationship of affection and mutual support. So this person, over time, over some 20, 25 years, they assemble a whole family. And they have a house people are living in, and they have land, and a successful practice as a midwife. And so do you want to know what happens next?
Yes, but before you tell us what happens next, what about the neighbors? Did they know about this?
So we don't know. There's not enough in the case report. All we have is the governor's report on this case, on a memorial to the emperor, where the governor is shocked, horrified to find this case of a sex predator in disguise living in heterodoxy, blah, blah, blah. So there's a lot we don't know. And it's, unfortunately, with these legal cases, often the questions I would most like to ask as a historian, the magistrates didn't ask, or at least they did not record it in the case report. It was irrelevant to judicial purposes. You usually only get information that's somehow relevant to identifying and prosecuting crime.
So tell us what happened at the end.
So this person, their name was Xiong Mumu, which means sort of sister-in-law Xiong. That's the name they went by. The family name is Xiong. They had kept in touch with their brother. They had one sibling, as far as we know, a brother. And their home county was, I forget, it's in the book, but it was maybe 50 miles away, something like that. So it was far, but not that far. They had somehow kept in touch with each other. Apparently their father had died at some point, and so the brother had taken over the family land. And what was typically done with inheritance in China was that sons would inherit equal shares. Daughters did not directly inherit. So if you had 3 sons, then the estate would be divided in 3 equal pieces. Each son would receive an equal share. There was no primogeniture, as you have in Europe. So in this case, Xiongmumu, the heroine of our story, told their brother that they wanted to have a full half share. And the brother basically said, no. And so I'm going to take it all. And so Xiongmumu then filed a lawsuit against their brother in court, accusing the brother of trying to seize his older sister's land, quote unquote. And so they're summoned to court, and the brother begins by saying, well, that's actually not my sister, that's my brother. And he's been pretending to be a woman all this time. And so the magistrate orders a midwife to do a strip search and examination of the body of Xiongmumu, and the midwife reports that this person indeed has what she identified as normal male anatomy. So the magistrate declares it to be a man masquerading as a woman. Right? Now, mind you, this person has lived in their community with no trouble, as far as we know, for more than 20 years. I forget exactly how many, but a long, long time. The neighbors, if they knew, they didn't care. This is a successful midwife, a very good midwife. So this raises all sorts of questions. For one thing, the lawsuit is kind of crazy. Why on earth did this person file a lawsuit, bring themselves to the attention of the magistrate? But also, it seems like the brother's logic was, if you want to live as a woman, then you get a daughter's share of the land, which is 0. and so Xiongmu seems to have wanted sort of to have their cake and eat it too, to live as a woman, but retain somehow the privileges of a man and inheritance. And so this is a complete contradiction.
It suggests that she was very confident in her position within the community.
Indeed. It's really kind of amazing. I mean, the chutzpah of this person.
What happens at the end?
So Xiongmumu and the brother are both then arrested. This is reported to the governor. The governor reports it to the emperor in a secret palace memorial, because the governor interprets this as falling into this broad category of heterodoxy, the man masquerading as woman, woman's attire. And so the governor proposes that Xiongmumu will be beaten to death, which is kind of an extraordinary extra-legal punishment. You don't find it in the code. The emperor says, well, I mean, as far as you tell me, there's no evidence of any crimes that are really deserving of death. So as an act of lenience, the emperor orders that this person, first of all, be dressed as a man, have their hair done the way a man should be, and then sentenced to the far north of Manchuria to spend the rest of their life as their slaves in the military.
We assume it wasn't a very long life. Then.
Right, well, exactly. Yeah. I'm not sure which would be worse, just being put to death or being sentenced to be a slave in the military, on the Russian border in Siberia. I guess that counted as lenience from the emperor's point of view. And then that we don't hear anything more. And the brother was punished too for having kept this secret all this time.
So why was it so unacceptable to masquerade as a woman?
So that is an interesting puzzle, especially when considered that in the opera, boys played female roles on stage all the time, and that was legal. It was stigmatized, but it was legal. And there was a whole kind of elite male fan culture focusing on fascination with these beautiful boys who performed female roles in the opera. So why then was this so unacceptable off stage? This gets back to something I started talking about, the question of choice versus not choice. People like the actors of female roles, they didn't choose to become actors of female roles as an act of sort of self-expression, right? They generally were sold to acting troupes by their parents. Some of them were kidnapped as boys, young boys. And then if they were seen to have aptitude, they were trained to perform these roles. And then when they reached their late teens and the sort of unmistakably masculine features became too obvious, then they tended to be sidelined, sort of let go. Those people did not choose. And I think part of what made these other kinds of gender transing acceptable is that they happened within institutional contexts with specifically coded protocols. They were not subversive acts of self-expression that were challenging the normative gender order. And in the case of these boys who played female roles, there was a whole sex trade on the side. They served as escorts and prostitutes, really, for elite men, elite male patrons. In a sense, they were serving the pleasure of elite men, far from being subversive of the order. You could say they were sort of reinforcing and upholding a kind of order, even though they were stigmatized. Same thing with these clergy I talked about, and the eunuchs, too. They were an accepted part of the normative order. In some ways, they respected normative gender roles, right? None of that was sort of a subversive act of self-expression. Like in the case of Xiongmumu, this was interpreted very differently. And here we have to bear in mind the misogyny that underlies all of this. Basically, I think Qing elites and judges and lawmakers, they could imagine no good reason why a man would, quote, pretend to be a woman, unquote, except to try to sneak into female space as a predator. Hence this stereotype of the male masquerading in female attire in order to seduce or rape women. I mean, there's a sort of long tradition of this stereotype in fiction and folklore. For the Qing, the sort of locus classicus of this image was a case from the early Ming Dynasty, from the 15th century, about this figure known as Shangchong. Shangchong appears to have been a real person because there is a brief summary of their legal case in the Ming Shi Lu. The Ming Shi Lu is the veritable records of the Ming Dynasty. This was a kind of official chronicle compiled by the imperial court. After an emperor would die at the beginning of the new emperor's reign, they would compile this chronicle of important events and edicts and things from the previous emperor's reign. So the fact that this case summary about Shangchong appears in that context means that at least the people who compiled that record believed this to be true. Now, the story of Shangchong was a beautiful male youth who learned black magic from this master sorcerer, Shanxi. And basically this black magic, it consisted of dressing as a woman, pretending to be a beautiful young woman, and learning all the women's arts of sewing and embroidery and so on. And then by presenting as a woman, traveling about and then seeking employment in the households of good families, maybe to teach the daughters embroidery or something like that. And then would be staying in the female quarters of the households. And then at night would come out of his disguise as this male and then either seduce or rape the women. If the victims of this predation yielded, then he would simply have sex with them. If they resisted, then he would use black magic, demonic possession, and so on, to rape them and drug.
This behavior is so deviant that you can only explain it by saying that this person is using black magic and is in cahoots with the evil.
That's right. And so it was associated with heterodoxy. It was prosecuted under this famous statute using heterodox methods to deceive and swindle the people. Usually that statute was used to prosecute religious sects or sworn brotherhoods that were believed to be seditious, believed to be anti-state, leading rebellions and so on. That's also worthy of skepticism, by the way. It was used for persecuting popular religion, really, that the elites didn't like. But one of the connections here is that so-called heterodox religious sects, the authorities believed them all to be frauds. So the leaders of these heterodox sects, these were basically con artists. They were con men, fraudsters, who were using some elaborate fraud to deceive the ordinary people who were gullible and ignorant and exploit them then for sex, to exploit them out of their money, to exploit them to rebel against the government. And so at the heart of heterodoxy was a kind of fraud and a kind of exploiting other people through deception, right? That in a sense is the conceptual link to this image of the sexual predator who is, quote, masquerading, unquote, as a woman in order to do these kinds of things, to get women for sex. And so the heart of it is this notion that this is all a fraud. Right? These are not real women, right? Rather, they are men pretending to be women for an ulterior motive. And again, in some ways, the world hasn't changed that much. This is the stereotype you get in transphobia in the modern world today, in the United States and Britain, perhaps elsewhere. So in the United States, we've had these bathroom laws banning transgender people from using public restrooms that fit the gender that is their identity. The reason behind that is there's this paranoid fantasy that trans women just want to get in women's bathrooms in order to seduce or rape little girls or women. It's actually pretty baroque if you think about it, because if some man wants to do that, why should he go to the trouble of dressing up as a woman? Why not just go in the bathroom? I mean, it doesn't make any sense to me, but what's striking is that, in a sense, it's the same kind of paranoid fantasy you get in 18th century China, completely different society and legal system. And yet there does seem to be this deep fear on the part of some people that attaches in particular to the trans woman. And trans women generally tend to be the targets of really virulent and vicious fear and persecution, quite frankly. In the United States, at least, trans women are targets of a great deal of violence. And the suicide rates are quite high as a result of this kind of persecution. There seems to be less obsession with trans men for reasons that aren't entirely clear to me. But it is interesting that you see these parallels across different times and places. And again, you can draw parallels between patriarchy in different times and places, between misogyny in different times and places. These are all somehow linked, I think, if that makes sense.
It does. Two questions here. You've just mentioned that it doesn't seem to be the case the other way around. So females masquerading as men, that didn't seem to be an issue in Imperial China. It doesn't seem to be that much of an issue today.
Yes.
So why not then?
Well, so I think, it relates to this obsession with control female sexuality, control women's chastity, and access to women. The assumption is that to use their terms, the man masquerading as a woman is a sexual predator who is targeting the chaste wives and daughters of good family, quote unquote. I mean, that was the rubric. So that's the threat. The threat is to female chastity. That's what they're really worried about. So if a woman pretends to be a man, quote unquote, that's not nearly as threatening. What are they going to do? Sneak into male space? I mean, I think they did not feel threatened by that. And, if you look at Qing law and imperial law in China generally, the sexual really was defined around the penis, the male organ, and what male subjects did to female or feminized objects, what they did to women or what they did to boys. Basically, it was framed in terms of an act of penetration where a man is either raping or having marital intercourse. Those are the two sides of the coin, right? Marital intercourse is legitimate. Sex outside of marriage is adultery or rape. And the law sort of focuses on the boundary between these and how you define the crimes and how you punish the crimes. But all of those are organized around a man with male anatomy acting upon a female or feminized object, right?
So this is basically about having control of women.
Yeah, oh yeah, for sure.
At the end.
So one of the things about the stereotype of the predator is that it's not really about transgender at all. So these individuals are not understood to be homosexual, for example, or having gender dysphoria, or being transgender. Any of these concepts people might use today or in the modern era to have talked about gender crossing of this kind. No, on the contrary, this is a hypersexual predator who is targeting female. So in a sense, it's a hyper heterosexual predator, to use modern terminology, right? Far from being gender ambiguous or interested in men or anything like that. This is somebody who wants women, and this is a kind of nefarious masquerade, a ruse.
What is China like today in terms of transgender issues and this relationship between men and women?
I don't really claim expertise on the situation in China today, and it's a fairly fluid situation legally and politically. But I think a lot of these old ideas survive in one form or another. This figure of the cross-dressing predator I mentioned, in Chinese, the term renyao is often used for this. So the renyao in Ming Qing times is a very frightening kind of demonic figure, like a vampire or something, right? Kind of a sexual vampire. But you see in sort of like post-Mao popular culture in China, the term renyao is used in new ways. It's a term of abuse for effeminate gay men, so it does have this sort of negative usage. But also, increasingly, it has been used for glamorous trans women, very beautiful, glamorous trans women. One thing that's interesting about this sort of glamorous renyao figure is it's always a glamorous trans woman who conforms to beauty ideals that are very mainstream. So the bai shou mei, the fair-skinned, thin, pretty ideal that you see in starlets and fashion models in China. These renyao trans women, they all conform to that. And yet what's interesting is that their glamour and their appeal, their fascination, it's not that audience members think they are women, cis women, it's that they know they are trans women. So it reminds me actually of the boys who played female roles in the opera back in Beijing Opera. The whole appeal there is not that the aficionados thought they were cis women, quite the contrary. And it was not just that they were boys, rather specifically it was that they were boys who were performing a certain kind of ideal femininity on stage, right, that appealed to elite taste. Well, I think in a way you have something like that going on with the sort of this glamorous trans woman phenomenon now. They appeal to a very specific kind of male gaze, but the fascination is based in part on the fact that they are known to be trans women. So I think the idea behind this male fascination is that this is a kind of artifice, a kind of performance of female glamour, that sort of ideal. And again, there's a misogyny there.
So 200 years on, and we have not changed.
Well, I mean, I got to say, people are people, and with all of our foibles.
Thank you so much. Do you have any last thoughts for the listeners?
Well, I will say that right now, at least in my country, trans people are under assault and are the objects of increasingly intense persecution. I am very aware of that. I wasn't thinking about that so much when I wrote the book, but I do hope that my book will be of some value or some use to trans people. And I want to express my friendship and solidarity with trans people everywhere. And my hope that they will simply be left alone and allowed to live their lives.
Professor Massower, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's been an honor.
Thank you for joining us on Exploring the Humanities from the Hong Kong Polytechnic University. For more episodes or information, visit our website or follow us on Spotify. Stay tuned for discussions with leading voices from the Faculty of Humanities and beyond.